The dream didn't start in a bedroom. It started in an argument, somewhere between a velvet couch and a stack of notebooks. Two men were already disagreeing politely, intensely, and with the kind of passion that only brilliant minds bring to small rooms and large ideas. Sigmund Freud stood near the couch, arms crossed, beard immaculate, gaze sharp. To him, nothing happened just because. Every slip of the tongue was a confession, every dream a coded message smuggled past the mind's guards. Across from him, by the window, stood Carl Jung, taller, calmer, eyes reflecting curiosity rather than suspicion. The night outside was quiet. Inside, the unconscious was loud. Freud cleared his throat. Dreams, he said, are wish fulfillment. Jung smiled. The way you smile when hearing a familiar tune played slightly off-key. Dreams, he replied, are guidance. This wasn't just a debate between two men. It was the beginning of a conflict that would shape how millions of us interpret our own inner worlds, especially at 3 in the morning, when the phone glows brighter than your conscience. Freud paced slowly. People dream because something inside them wants release, he said. Unfulfilled desires, repressed impulses. The mind is clever, but not noble. It disguises, it hides, it sneaks. Jung leaned against the window frame, and yet, he said, people wake up changed. Sometimes wiser, sometimes warned, sometimes comforted. That is not merely release, that is conversation. Freud raised an eyebrow. A conversation with whom? The unconscious, Jung said gently. Not as a criminal, but as a teacher. Now, this is probably a good moment to tap the like button, not because you agree with either man yet, but because your own dreams are probably listening. And if you enjoy thoughtful arguments like this, consider subscribing. We're just getting started. Freud stopped pacing and sat on the couch. Let us be honest, he said. When a man dreams of flying, it is not about transcendence. It is about power. When someone dreams of being chased, it is not spiritual symbolism. It is anxiety, guilt, desire running faster than morality. Jung laughed softly, and when a woman dreams of walking through a dark forest, he asked. Freud didn't hesitate. Fear or desire she cannot admit. Jung nodded, then added, or the beginning of transformation. Freud sighed. You see poetry where I see pathology. And you see pathology, Jung replied, where I see potential. This might sound abstract or academic, but this debate didn't stay in Vienna or Zurich. It followed us into our modern bedrooms, into the strange dreams you have after scrolling social media at midnight and promising yourself just one more video. Freud, if he were alive today, might gesture at a smartphone and say, see, repression with Wi-Fi. Jung, standing beside him, might add, yes, and symbols now come with notifications. Freud leaned forward. Tell me, he said, why do people dream of missing trains, failing exams, losing their teeth? Jung smiled. Because life keeps asking questions they avoid answering. Freud shook his head. No, because the ego is under threat. Because the animal inside is anxious about survival. And yet, Jung replied, those dreams often come before change. A new job, a breakup, a realization. Freud waved a hand. Correlation is not meaning. Jung nodded. True, but repetition is not. Accident. If you've ever woken up from a dream and thought, why did my mind do that to me? Congratulations. You're already part of this conversation. And if you want more explorations like this, more stories where old thinkers argue about modern minds, subscribing is a small action with surprisingly large symbolic value. Jung would appreciate that. Freud stood again, energized. You romanticize the unconscious, he said. You make it sound wise. I have seen it. It is childish. It wants pleasure. It avoids pain. It throws tantrums at night. Jung's eyes softened. Children, he said, are not foolish. They speak in images because language comes later. Freud frowned. So now the unconscious is a child. No, Jung said. It is a storyteller. Silence followed, a meaningful one. Freud broke the quiet. Explain this, he said. A man dreams repeatedly of being naked in public. Humiliation, exposure. Desire mixed with fear. Classic. Jung nodded yes. Or perhaps the psyche is asking him to stop hiding. Freud blinked. You see, you moralize. And you medicalize, Jung replied. Today, we Google our dreams. We ask apps. We ask strangers online. We hope for answers that are fast and comforting. Freud would likely roll his eyes. Jung would likely ask what the dream felt like. But both would agree on one thing. Dreams matter because we care about them. Freud returned to the couch. Dreams, he said firmly, are the mind's safety valve. Jung crossed his arms. Dreams, he said calmly, are the soul's compass. They looked at each other. Two truths. One night. And maybe that's why this debate refuses to end. Because part of us wants explanations and part of us wants meaning. So the question remains open, waiting for the next night you close your eyes. Are your dreams hiding something or guiding you towards something? The argument didn't end. Arguments like this never do. It simply changed temperature, cooler on the surface, warmer underneath, like coffee forgotten for a minute and then remembered too late. Sigmund Freud sat again, crossing one leg over the other, the posture of a man who believed that sitting down did not mean backing down. Across the room, Carl Jung remained standing as if movement helped thoughts breathe. And you could see something subtle. Neither man was trying to win any more. They were trying to understand why the other refused to lose. Freud spoke first. Let us imagine, he said, a woman dreams of arguing with her mother. Loud voices, old resentments, nothing mystical. It is memory. Conflict replayed, the mind clearing its throat. Jung nodded thoughtfully. Or, he said, the psyche practicing courage. Freud exhaled sharply. You insist on turning psychological housekeeping into a hero's journey. And you, Jung replied, insist on treating every inner image like a crime scene. And you know, if Freud and Jung were alive today, this would be the part where someone comments, both of you are right, and both would immediately disagree with that person. Freud leaned forward. People dream, he said, because they suppress too much during the day. Civilization demands restraint. Dreams give relief. That is their function. Jung tilted his head. And yet, some dreams disturb rather than relieve. They warn. They confront. They challenge comfort. Freud waved his hand dismissively. Anxiety dreams. The ego fails to censor. Jung smiled. Or the unconscious refuses to be ignored. A pause. Outside this room, somewhere between then and now, people were waking up from dreams that felt important without knowing why. Dreams that lingered longer than alarm clocks. Dreams that made them question habits, relationships, careers. Freud would call that unresolved tension. Jung would call it an invitation. If you've ever said, I can't stop thinking about that dream, congratulations, you're already siding with Jung, even if you've never heard his name. And if you've ever said, that dream was weird and probably means nothing, Freud just nodded somewhere in history. If this conversation feels uncomfortably familiar, that's because it lives inside you too. And if you enjoy the kind of discomfort the productive kind, hit that like button, subscribe, and let the algorithms become symbols. Jung would absolutely laugh at that sentence. Freud stood up again. He could not stay still when defending a theory. Tell me, he said, why do dreams so often exaggerate? Why are symbols absurd, teeth falling out, endless staircases, doors that lead nowhere? Jung answered without hesitation, because the unconscious does not speak prose, it speaks poetry. Freud frowned. Poetry obscures. Poetry reveals, Jung replied, just not directly. Freud scoffed. A convenient excuse. No, Jung said. A necessary one. Notice something else. Here, Freud always begins with cause. Jung always begins with purpose. One looks backward, the other forward. Freud gestured as if drawing a diagram in the air. The mind is layered. Conscious on top, repressed material below. Dreams allow what is buried to surface disguised so it does not shock. Jung nodded slowly. Yes, but what surfaces is not only personal memory. There are patterns, shared images, Archetypes, Freud froze. Oh, there it is. There what? Jung asked. Your mythology? Freud replied. You smuggle gods into psychology? Jung laughed. Genuinely this time. And you pretend humans stopped telling stories when science arrived. Silence again. Heavier now. This is where things get modern. Imagine a man today dreaming of scrolling endlessly through his phone, never reaching the end. Freud would say, anxiety about productivity, fear of time wasted, desire for stimulation. Jung would say, a symbol of meaning deferred, the psyche warning of distraction from purpose. Now imagine that man waking up tired. Freud would prescribe insight. Jung would prescribe reflection. Both would suggest fewer screens before bed, though neither would admit it was that simple. Freud resumed pacing. Dreams are backward-looking. He insisted they process the past. Jung crossed his arms, and yet he said they prepare the future. Freud shook his head. You give dreams too much credit. Jung replied softly, and you give consciousness too much control. This line deserves a pause. Modern neuroscience, yes, actual sleep science suggests dreams help integrate memory, emotion, and learning. Freud would smile smugly. Jung would smile differently, same data, different stories. Freud sat once more, rubbing his temples. People come to me suffering, he said. Dreams reveal what hurts. Jung stepped closer. People come to me searching, he said. Dreams reveal what is missing. They looked at each other, this time without irony. Something important had shifted, not agreement but recognition. Freud sighed. Perhaps, he said reluctantly, we are studying different sides of the same phenomenon. Jung's eyes brightened slightly. Perhaps, he said, you listen for wounds, and I listen for direction. Freud smirked. A generous interpretation. Jung smiled. A symbolic one. Somewhere, a future viewer clicks subscribe without knowing why. Freud would call it habit formation. Jung would call it synchronicity. I call it good timing. Freud leaned back. But let us be careful, he said. If people believe dreams are messages from a higher wisdom, they may surrender responsibility. Jung nodded seriously. And if people believe dreams are only garbage disposal for the mind, they may ignore their inner life. The room felt balanced now, tense, but honest. Modern self-help books borrow from both men shamelessly. Decode your dreams on one page. Trust your intuition on the next. Freud would complain about dilution. Jung would enjoy the hybridity. Freud stood and extended a hand not for peace, but for continuation. Tomorrow, he said, we discuss nightmares. Jung took the hand. Good, he replied. They are the most honest dreams. The lights dimmed. The unconscious waited patiently, as it always does, because the question was evolving now not just what dreams are, but what we do with them. Are they symptoms to analyze, or symbols to live by? Nightmares don't knock. They crash. They arrive without manners, without softened metaphors, without any concern for your morning schedule. This is precisely why Sigmund Freud saw them as failures of censorship, while Carl Jung saw them as urgent letters stamped read immediately. Let's imagine the scene. Morning light filters into a room, pale and undecided. The argument, however, is fully awake. Freud stands by the window, watching the street. Nightmares, he says, are dreams that did not do their job. Jung sits calmly, hands folded. Or dreams, he replies, that refuse to lie. Freud turns. You see drama. I see dysfunction, and I, Jung answers, see honesty where comfort has failed. I'll pause here, because if you've ever woken from a nightmare with your heart racing, mind foggy, and phone already in hand, you are not alone. Humanity's first instinct after terror is reassurance. Freud would call it anxiety discharge. Jung would call it avoiding reflection. Modern life would say, open an app. If this already sounds a little too accurate, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Jung loved irony. Freud tolerated it. Freud returns to his argument. When a person dreams of falling, he says it reflects a loss of control. When chased, unresolved fear. Nightmares just intensify what the mind can't soften. Jung nods. Yes, because sometimes intensity is necessary. Freud scoffs. You believe terror teaches? I believe, Jung replies. That terror interrupts denial. There's a silence again, but it's not empty, it's loaded. Here's what's really happening. Freud is concerned with stability. Jung is concerned with growth. One wants peace restored. The other wants truth revealed even if peace has to wait. Freud sits down heavily. People already suffer enough, he says. Why must the psyche torment them at night? Jung leans forward. Because the psyche is not polite. He says, it is loyal to wholeness. Freud frowns. That sounds suspiciously moral. No, Jung replies. It is biological honesty with symbolic language. Freud considers this for a moment, then dismisses it. Let us speak of repetition, he says. Recurring nightmares, same image, same fear. Again and again, this is trauma. Jung nods slowly, yes. And trauma that isn't integrated becomes a messenger that refuses to leave. Freud raises a finger. Treatment requires insight. Awareness dissolves the repetition, and yet, Jung says softly, some people understand their trauma perfectly and still dream. This is where modern therapy quietly enters the room, nodding at both men, and borrowing techniques from each without asking permission. Freud starts pacing again. Dreams replay the past. He insists. Nightmares just replay it louder. Jung stands, or they ask, he says, what you will do differently next time. Freud stops pacing. You assume choice. I assume agency, Jung replies. Another pause. Outside, a car horn honks, a reminder that the world doesn't stop for theory. Let's bring today into the room. Imagine someone dreaming repeatedly of being overwhelmed by emails and deadlines that multiply, faster than they can answer them. Freud would diagnose stress and unmet demands. Jung would ask, what is asking for your attention that you keep postponing? Both would recommend better boundaries, but only one would ask what boundary you are afraid to draw. Freud resumes, dream interpretation must remain grounded, he says. Otherwise, people turn symbols into superstition. Jung nods, agreed. Symbols are not fortune-telling. Then why? Freud presses, do people feel guided by dreams? Jung smiles gently. Because guidance doesn't require certainty, only resonance. A dangerous word. Freud rolls his eyes. A human one. Jung replies, this is exactly where modern self-help goes wrong and sometimes right. We want quick answers. This dream means X. Freud would hate that. Jung would hate it too, but for different reasons. To Jung, dreams were questions, not instructions. Freud sits back down. Let us be clear. He says, dreams do not predict the future. Jung nods. No, he says they prepare the psyche to meet it. Freud pauses. That is carefully phrased. Jung smiles. I practice. If you're smiling too, maybe it's the perfect time to subscribe. Freud would call it conditioned behavior. Jung would call it perfect timing. I just call it appreciated. Freud leans forward. Serious again. What concerns me, he says, is that people romanticize suffering. Jung's expression softens. What concerns me, he replies, is that people normalize numbness. They look at each other. No jokes now. This isn't a battle of right versus wrong. It's a tension between relief and meaning, between healing pain and answering the questions that pain points toward. Freud speaks quietly. Dreams should help people sleep. Jung answers just as quietly. Dreams should help people wake up. The line hangs in the air. Freud breaks the silence with a sigh. Perhaps, he says, we are describing two phases. Jung raises an eyebrow. Explain. First, Freud says the dream releases pressure. Then if one insists it may be reflected upon. Jung nods slowly. Yes, and perhaps reflection turns release into direction. Freud smirks. You almost sound like me. Jung chuckles. You almost sound like you're listening. The tension lightens. Today, neuroscience speaks of memory consolidation and threat simulation. Freud hears validation. Jung hears symbolism translated. Both nod, but neither is fully satisfied. Freud stands, stretching. Tomorrow, he says, we discuss lucid dreaming. Jung's eyes light up. He says, when the dreamer realizes he is dreaming. Freud raises an eyebrow. Control, he says. Jung smiles. Dialogue, he replies, lucidity changes everything, not because the dream becomes obedient, but because the dreamer becomes present. When Sigmund Freud first heard the word lucid, he reacted with visible suspicion. To him, awareness inside a dream sounded like a security breach, but to Carl Jung, it sounded like an invitation finally accepted. Imagine them in a room, the mood less argumentative, more curious. As if the topic had quietly outgrown them both, Freud adjusts his glasses. So, he says, the dreamer knows he is dreaming, yes. Jung replies and chooses how to respond. Freud frowns. Response implies agency. Dreams are involuntary. Until Jung says calmly, they aren't. Freud folds his arms. This smells like an illusion of control. Jung smiles. And yet control is not always the point. Now, let's pause. If you've ever realized you were dreaming and immediately tried to fly, congratulations, you instinctively sided with Freud. You sought power, mastery, wish fulfillment with better graphics. But if, instead, you paused, looked around, and asked the dream what it wanted, Jung just quietly applauded. If this resonates with you, tap that like button. If it just confuses you, subscribe anyway. Confusion is where learning sneaks in. Freud starts pacing. Lucid dreaming, he declares, is merely the ego intruding where it does not belong. Jung shakes his head. No, it is consciousness learning to listen without drowning out the voice beneath. Freud stops. You make it sound cooperative. It is, Jung replies, when done well. Freud scoffs, and when done poorly, then, Jung says, it becomes domination. The dream collapses, symbols flatten, meaning evaporates. Freud raises an eyebrow. You sound like a disappointed director. Jung laughs. Only when the actors forget why they're on stage. You see, there's a subtle tension here. Freud fears chaos, Jung fears disconnection, and lucid dreaming sits exactly on that fault line. Freud resumes, people seek lucidity to escape fear. He says, to control nightmares, yes. Jung agrees, and sometimes, he adds, they discover the nightmare wants to talk. Freud rolls his eyes. Again with the talking, yes. Jung smiles, because repression does not disappear when ignored, only when integrated. Freud considers this longer than before. Now, think about our modern world. There are apps to teach lucid dreaming, devices to track sleep, stages, online forums trading techniques like recipes. Freud would worry about obsession. Jung would worry about superficiality. Freud speaks again. If dreams are messages, he says, then lucidity risks editing the message before it is received. Jung nods. That is the danger, and also the opportunity. Freud tilts his head. Explain. When lucid, Jung says, one may ask instead of command, observe instead of alter, participate without hijacking. Freud smirks. You want people to negotiate with hallucinations. Jung shrugs. People negotiate with their thoughts all day. Dreams simply remove the filter. A thoughtful silence follows. Practices like mindfulness, meditation, and therapy all echo this very idea. Awareness without domination. Freud might call it ego strength. Jung might call it individuation. Same mountain, different trails. Freud sits down. What concerns me, he says, is narcissism. The dreamer becomes the hero of every inner story. Jung nods seriously. Yes, and that is precisely why humility is essential. Freud looks surprised. You agree? I do, Jung replies. Lucidity without humility turns insight into spectacle. Freud smiles faintly. Now you sound like me. Jung laughs. Careful. People might notice. Somewhere, a viewer smiles and subscribes. Freud would call it reinforcement. Jung would call it alignment. We just call it helpful. Freud leans forward. Tell me, he says, what would you have a lucid dreamer do? Jung answers slowly. Ask questions. Why this image? Why now? What happens if I do not run? What if I listen? Freud nods. And if the dream answers? Then, Jung says, one wakes with more than relief. Freud crosses his arms. You still believe dreams guide? I believe, Jung replies. They reflect the direction we are already moving. Consciously or not, Freud considers this. Then perhaps lucidity merely accelerates awareness. Jung's eyes light up. Yes, he says, exactly. Freud pauses. That is acceptable. High praise and rare. The room feels lighter now. We're seeing a convergence, not agreement, but overlap. Freud's mechanisms, Jung's meanings, and modern science's data, all circling the same mystery. Freud speaks again. But let us not forget, dreams remain private, subjective, dangerous if universalized. Jung nods. Symbols speak differently to different lives. Freud raises a finger. So no dream dictionary? Never, Jung agrees firmly. Somewhere on the internet, a dream dictionary just felt a chill. Freud stands and stretches. One final concern. He says, people chase insight instead of living. Jung replies gently, and others live without, ever reflecting. Freud nods. Balance then. Jung smiles. Always. Evening approaches. The final question is approaching now, not about dreams themselves, but about the dreamer's life after waking. The most important part of a dream is not the dream. It is the morning after. Sigmund Freud knew this, and Carl Jung knew it too. From a distance, you can see their final conversation wasn't about who was right, but about what people do next. Evening light stretched long shadows across the floor. Freud broke the silence. People, he said, are obsessed with meaning. Jung nodded and terrified of it. Freud turned, surprised. You agree? Of course, Jung replied. Meaning demands responsibility. Freud exhaled slowly. Yes, and responsibility is heavier than desire. This is a sentence both men secretly shared. Freud continued. When people ask what their dreams mean, they often want absolution or permission. Jung nodded. Or reassurance that their suffering is not random. Freud sat. And sometimes, he added, it isn't. Jung smiled gently. And sometimes it is. This is a good moment to pause and think. Not because answers are coming, but because honest questions just arrived. Freud leaned back. I worry, he said, that people use dreams to avoid action. Jung replied calmly, and I worry they use action to avoid reflection. Freud smirked. Again. Balance. Again. Jung smiled. Always. You can feel how far they've come. Their early arguments were sharp, territorial. Now, the disagreement feels cooperative, like to maps drawn from different angles of the same landscape. Freud spoke again. Let us imagine a person wakes from a dream feeling unsettled. What should they do? Jung answered without hesitation. Live the question. Freud frowned. That is vague, yes. Jung agreed, because answers are often premature. Freud considered this. I would say they should examine their waking life. Where is tension? Where is avoidance? Jung nodded. And I would ask, where is growth asking for courage? Freud paused. These are not incompatible. No, Jung replied. They are sequential. Here's a quiet truth modern psychology often forgets. Insight without action becomes rumination. Action without insight becomes repetition. Freud continued, dreams do not replace thinking. Jung nodded. No, they provoke it. Freud smiled faintly. Good distinction. Today, we track our sleep, analyze our dreams, and post interpretations online. Freud would warn against exhibitionism. Jung would warn against shallowness. Both would warn against outsourcing self-understanding. Freud spoke softly. I never claimed dreams were wise, only honest. Jung responded just as softly. And I never claimed they were commands, only mirrors. Freud looked thoughtful. Then perhaps the danger lies not in dreams, but in dreamers. Jung smiled. Or in forgetting that Waking life is where meaning must be carried. The room felt complete, not resolved but complete. Freud stood. So, are dreams wish fulfillment or guidance? Jung stood beside him, yes. He replied. Freud laughed, a short, genuine sound. You refuse to choose. Jung shrugged. Human beings rarely fit into single explanations. Freud nodded slowly. That is unfortunately true. They walked toward the door together, not as rivals, but as colleagues. Dreams may disguise desire. They may reveal fear. They may point toward growth, or simply clear emotional clutter. What matters is not which theory you believe, but whether you listen without surrendering responsibility. Freud reminds us, do not romanticize the unconscious. Jung reminds us, do not ignore it either. Between wish and wisdom, between impulse and insight, dreams invite you into a conversation you cannot delegate. And when you wake up, the real work begins. Because the final question was never, what does the dream mean? The final question is, what will you do now that you've heard it? Thanks for watching. If this made you think, consider subscribing for more conversations like this.